Okay, in this video, I'm going to review the nature and purpose of research for a philosophy paper and share some tips for getting started. We'll take a look at how to use the library's website, but we'll begin by taking a look at how to use Google effectively to do research for a philosophy paper specifically. So question number one is, what do you mean do research for a philosophy paper? What is research in philosophy? Well, we're looking for sources, for something. What is it we are looking for when we start Googling or when we go to the library to do our research? What kinds of sources are we looking for? What do we want to do with them? Well, let's start with what we want to do when we need the facts, right? So say you're writing on the topic of the moral obligations of the affluent given the fact that so many people around the world live in conditions of extreme poverty. Well, you might need to know some of the facts about extreme poverty, including how many people around the world live in extreme poverty. So if you need to know something like that, you're going to have to find reputable sources for that information, and the purpose of that source is to back up your factual claims about the poverty rates or whatever. So you find a reputable source, something like the World Bank, and that backs up whatever claim you make about the number of people living in conditions of extreme poverty. That's one way to use a source for this kind of purpose. This is not the primary way that we use sources in a philosophy paper. In a philosophy paper, you're not primarily looking for sources that back up what you're trying to say, like the source itself is your evidence or the support for your claim. Instead, you're looking for influential or interesting participants in a background conversation to your topic. You're looking for big ideas and, more importantly, arguments. Because we are writing philosophy papers, and philosophy papers, depending on the kind of philosophy you're doing, but usually essentially involve arguments. So you're looking for some of the most influential or interesting arguments. We're going to take a look at the library, but like I said, let's start with Google. What's the quickest way to get a sense of the background conversation relevant to my topic, whatever it is? Well, let's assume that our topic is something having to do with eating animals, the ethics of eating animals, some kind of philosophical question that connects with eating animals. Okay, I haven't narrowed it down quite yet, but something like that. How do I do research for this? Well, let's start by looking at philosophy encyclopedias online. Okay, so I'm just going to Google philosophy encyclopedia, and the top two returned are the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The next hit is just the table of contents for that encyclopedia, and the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. These are both great resources for getting a sense of a background conversation to a philosophical topic. For what it's worth, the Internet Encyclopedia is more accessible to a beginning philosophy student. The Stanford Encyclopedia entries can be a little bit more complex and difficult for a beginner. But they're both great. They both have entries written by reputable sources, some of the most reputable sources in the field, and they're both peer-reviewed. Let's take a look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and let's just search for something vague like animals. We can see there are a few things, but let's start with something like the moral status of animals. What you'll get is a big picture overview of the background conversation on the moral status of animals. You're going to get a series of arguments and objections fit together into a larger conversation, and you can see sort of an overview of that when you look at the table of contents. You'll also find a bibliography, so if you want to follow up on one of the lines of argument or objections or ideas that you encounter, you can find them in the bibliography. And in general, when you are reading academic sources, whether it's an encyclopedia or a journal article, academic writers provide citations not just to avoid plagiarism, but because they're part of this larger conversation, and when you provide your citations, you are inviting others to follow along with your research, to go back and look at it for themselves, to engage with it themselves, and maybe contribute to the conversation. So it's something you should do when you write your papers, and it's something you can expect authors to do who are engaged in this background conversation. Okay, and we can find the author and citation information here. Let's go back and look at the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And again, let's search for something vague like animals. Okay, and we've got a few returns. Let's check out animals and ethics. Again, we're going to get an overview of a background conversation on ethical questions and arguments pertaining to animals. There's a table of contents, and if we scroll all the way to the bottom, an identifiable author. Here's another good way to get a snapshot of some of the most important texts or authors in a conversation. Google the syllabus, right? So once animal ethics is very broad. This might work if you have something more specific, like if you specifically want to talk about eating animals, because animal ethics could include doing research on animals or something like that, using them like medical research projects. It could include a variety of things. So you could get more specific, but Googling syllabus and then looking for academics who teach classes and seeing what kinds of papers they assign to their students, because these are knowledgeable people who are choosing some of the most important texts to share with their students. So that's another way that you can search for the relevant conversation to your topic. That is fast and easy and involves using Google. Another great resource which you can use to try to figure out what the background conversation is, but even better, follow up on sources once you've identified some, is to use Scholar. It's like Google, except for you can search peer-reviewed stuff instead of just everything that's on the internet. So let's check out eating animals. Okay, you've got some things you can adjust over here if you want to refine your search. When you are looking at the returns, you need to know what kind of papers you're looking for. We're looking for contributors to philosophical conversations. So the psychology of eating animals, that may be relevant to a philosophical topic, but this isn't a philosophical paper, presumably. It's psychology. The journal is hidden, so maybe I could be wrong, but eating animals the nice way. That sounds philosophical. If you're not familiar with the journal, you could Google that and see if it's a philosophy academic journal. You can also, if there's a PDF, check out the PDF to see if it looks like something you're interested in engaging with. Google Scholar is great, but you have to do the work of making sense of the sources. Are they providing philosophical arguments? Are they involved in the conversation that you are tasked with writing about, presumably in a philosophy class? A nice thing about Google Scholar is that it often includes links to the actual papers. You can see how often this particular piece of writing, book or article, is cited, which can give you a sense of how influential it is. It's a rough measure, but it's a measure of how influential something is. You can follow up on who has cited it by clicking on this, right? So every one of these papers cites the last one I was just looking at. So this is a kind of way to follow a conversation, but it's probably not as easy to follow as starting with an encyclopedia entry or perhaps a syllabus, where somebody who is familiar with the conversation has identified some of the important ideas, people, or arguments. What about just plain Googling? What is the place of Google in doing research for an academic paper? It gets a bad rap, but Google can be used effectively if you know what you're looking for. So what are we looking for? Okay, as we've said a bunch of times now, we're looking for influential or interesting participants in the relevant background conversation to our topic, and we want reputable sources. What are reputable sources when we're just plain Googling, right? What's a good, credible source? Okay, here are some rough rules of thumb. It's not a perfect answer, but you probably want a source with an identifiable author. And ideally, this author has contributed influential or interesting ideas or clarifications or arguments to our background conversation, and the author has fleshed out their ideas and arguments carefully and in sufficient depth to make them worth engaging with. What we ultimately want to write about is arguments that are good and thoughtful and are worth talking about when we are participating in this conversation. And identifiable authors who've played a role in this conversation and who have fleshed out their ideas and arguments carefully are more likely to have these kinds of good, thoughtful, worthy of our attention engagement arguments. Now, who is likely to have such arguments which meet these conditions? How do you know if something meets these conditions? Well, a rule of thumb is to look at the author. What are the credentials of the author? If you're writing a philosophy paper, engaging with academic philosophers, people who publish work, books, journals in peer-reviewed venues, people who are employed at reputable institutions and have the job of teaching and doing philosophy. And look at the publication or the venue where the work is published. So academic journals, peer-reviewed philosophy encyclopedias, books, right? So these are indicators, and this is another kind of indicator, right? So you need to have an identifiable author to identify some of these indicators to figure out if they have contributed important, influential, interesting ideas, which are fleshed out in some depth, such that they are good, thoughtful, worthy of our engagement. Of course, these are rules of thumb. Sometimes voices are left out of the conversation and are worth bringing in. So occasionally, the more you know about a conversation and the more knowledge you have of other areas, be it of philosophy or other disciplines, maybe you can expand the conversation by bringing in voices that aren't already included, right? So figuring out what people are already saying. Sometimes we need to disrupt that. And that's a case when, you're not just looking for academic philosophers writing in particular kinds of venues. Also, academic philosophers write in public venues, so we can find interesting, fleshed out ideas and arguments there. Sometimes we're interested in what ordinary lay people, non-philosophers think and argue so that we can critically examine it. And so that's a kind of thing we might look for in our own conversations, in our social media circles, and just by Googling. So it depends. We can engage with any arguments, at least in theory, in our philosophy papers, but it should be connected to a background conversation in some important way, especially if you are writing a paper where you have been reading contributions to this conversation. You've got assigned texts and authors. You should be engaging with those for sure. As previously mentioned, oftentimes academic philosophers write in public venues. For example, the Stone of the New York Times. It's a sort of op-ed collection has contributions by contemporary philosophers and thinkers on timely issues. So here are some of the most recent publications. Humans or animals. Okay, so we're going to get some kind of claim about humans or animals. I bet if we scroll down, we'll get quite a few things about animals because it is a common, important topic. So are we the cows of the future? I recently read one about the treatment of animals in connection with the pandemic. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in public places that are worth engaging with. What if we just plain Google a search term like eating animals? Okay, we're going to turn up some books, a Wikipedia page, same book, movies. It's not clear that this is a super helpful search term. We could either choose a more specific search term than eating animals, or we might just add philosophy after it. And notice when you do that, you start getting some common things people search for. So we can certainly choose better search terms than eating animals. What philosophers have to say about it, I'm not familiar with theconversation.com as a source. Let's check it out. Here's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosopher. Is there a moral case for eating meat? Something like Vox. There's a BBC entry. Let's take a look at that. There's another Wikipedia entry. What's the role for sources like this in doing research for a philosophy paper? And are these the kinds of sources we should use, engage with, in writing a philosophy paper? Well, the answer is it depends. As a general rule of thumb, these are probably not going to be great sources or main sources you should be engaged with. Sometimes teachers will ask you not to engage with these kinds of sources. Let's take a look at them and think about how they might fit into our research process. So let's check out this first one. And like I said, I'm not familiar with this. So we've got, it claims it has academic rigor and journalistic flair. So we might sort of, in general, read the about on this and see what kind of publication this is. What are some of the kinds of topics you'll find in this? It looks like maybe an online magazine of some kind. Who's the author? The author is a professor of philosophy, so this seems like the kind of person who would have something to say and be able to explain and develop and connect some of the important arguments. And this might point us to future sources or additional sources that we can follow up on ourselves. If the arguments presented here are short and simple, just to give you a taste, well, then the issue isn't the source itself, it's that it doesn't give you that much to work with. Now, if all you want to do for your paper is quick introduce this kind of argument and then you develop your own version of it or go further with it or consider an objection to it or something like that in a broader conversation where you are engaging with presumably assigned sources of some type, then it might be fine. But if you're just writing about this one source and you're just offering an argument this person made as something that could back up your claim, I'm putting back up in scare quotes here, then it might not be a good use of a source like this. So it depends. How about the BBC Ethics Guide? What kind of source is this? It looks like a quick overview of a bunch of different ways of arguing for or against. I'm not sure if these are all potential arguments against eating animals, but they're very short arguments, and I don't see an identifiable author. So what might the role of this kind of paper be? I'm probably not going to use this as a major source in my paper. I will keep track of it as a source I used in sort of thinking about the topic and Googling around. You always want to keep track of stuff you've looked at, and that's influenced your thinking on the topic in parts you don't end up plagiarizing it. But what am I going to do with this source? Well, it points me to a few kinds of arguments. If this is all you're engaged with in your paper, it's probably not enough. But if these are little, like, here's a kind of argument, I have more to say about it, or it points you to future research, additional research on a particular kind of topic, then this could be useful, the snapshot of different arguments. So it depends. And the major risk with using Google is that it requires your own knowledge and ability to identify what matters, what is reputable, and you also need to know what your purpose is in using different kinds of sources and whether or not you are engaged with the background conversation. So if you're pretty sure you are engaged with the right background conversation, you've done your work in figuring out what it is, and you have some of these good sources, but you just have, you want to throw in, like, here's another interesting kind of argument, and you develop it for yourself, then getting something off the BBC might be interesting, but it depends. Okay, we looked at Googling. A great place to get started is Encyclopedias. A great place to find accessible, meaning PDFs are often posted. Scholarly work is Google Scholar. We looked at using Google, which can be a perfectly fine thing to do, but you need to know how to do it well. Finally, let's end by looking at our library's website. So academic libraries are a guide to finding stuff in the library, and you can also find electronic resources. There's usually an opportunity to ask librarians. Can't stress enough how helpful librarians are, so if you need help doing research, don't hesitate to ask a librarian. You can also usually find, like, research guides for various fields. Let's just start by looking for online texts using Mesa's OneSearch here. So let's look at eating animals and see what happens. So you're going to get a variety of kinds of resources. Maybe some of them are philosophy texts, and maybe some of them are psychology texts, and you'll have to do some work in making sure you're getting the right kinds. Notice you can sort of narrow your search terms here so that you are only searching scholarly peer-reviewed stuff. And you can search by stuff that's available online if you can't make it to the library to look at it. You can search by different kinds of resources. So that's one very general way to do it. Another thing you can do is check out databases. Different libraries have access to different databases. There are some great ones in philosophy that we don't necessarily have access to, so I'm just going to go by subject and select philosophy and religion, so it will select all of the relevant databases, and it looks like there's only one. And you'll be asked to enter your information, because you'll have access to stuff that's not publicly available. As we've already seen, when we search animals, we're likely to return work on animals from all kinds of subjects. So one thing we can do is go to an advanced search here. And we'll type in animals. Again, we're being pretty vague here. When you have a more specific topic, you can be more specific in choosing your search terms, but I'm just going to type animals here, and then I'm going to go down. You can, require that you've got the documents, we can look at them, not just get citations, and that they're from peer-reviewed journals if we want, and then we can also identify a publication subject, so that way we definitely get something from philosophy. And when we do that, we return 29 things. It's not very much. If we exclude the full text, we can definitely return a lot more, but there might be some interesting stuff in these 29 hits. If we remove this requirement, we'll get a lot more, and then maybe we can look for them on Google or something if we identify interesting looking titles. And sometimes you can get a preview of the abstract as well, which helps you figure out if this is something you're interested in reading and writing about. Another neat tool is this topic finder. This is just a generally neat thing. It might not be the best tool for doing research for a philosophy paper, just because it looks like there aren't that many titles the library has access to. So if we click on animal ethics, we're not getting too many hits, but there might be some. So we clicked on ethics, that's a lot of ethical issues. So this is kind of a neat way just to visualize topics and relationships between topics. But again, you're going to have to carefully choose what kinds of articles you're looking for, where you're looking for arguments in philosophical conversations. And that's a wrap. We've looked at what we're trying to do when we do research for a philosophy paper. We're looking for philosophical arguments in conversations. And we've looked at some places where we can look for those conversations and arguments, including the library, which I can't recommend enough, an often overlooked resource, and of course Google, an often overused resource, but for a reason. It is easy, and there is a lot of great stuff on Google. You just have to use it more carefully. So look for the Internet Encyclopedias, check out Google Scholar, and know what you're looking for when you use plain old Google. And for philosophy, we have some rules of thumb that'll help us to Google more effectively. These are rules of thumb, not exceptionless rules, but they're pretty good ones to follow when you are Googling. And that is a quick primer on how to do research for a philosophy paper for beginning philosophy students.